Hello, everybody. My name is Ravi Brahmat. I am a student, a doctoral student at University of Houston, Clear Lake, and I have the honor and pleasure of asking questions directly to Dr. Paul Wagner. Dr. Wagner is a full-time professor of philosophy and logic with University of Houston, Clear Lake College of Human Sciences and Humanities. Also the area coordinator for statistics, research, and educational psychology with University of Houston's College of Education. He's the former vice president of Association of Philosophers in Education and a former executive secretary of the Philosophy of Education Society. Wow, what an honor it is to be able to ask some questions. And this is really related to your book, Dr. Wagner, Knowing for Education. It's a book that you've published, and I have some questions for you to try to get some of that wisdom from you and record it for the metaverse of YouTube and for all of us to be able to share this good education on the internet. So Dr. Wagner, I'll start off with the hardest question that all of us have to deal with, is what is truth?
Good question. And actually, I have a simple definition for you. Truth is a representation that maps onto the world as the world is without error. That definition identifies an ideal. It doesn't necessarily tell us something about what we have in our hands at any given moment. It identifies an ideal. So let me repeat it. It's a representation that maps onto the world without error.
So Dr. Wagner, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I was like, hey, why are you not responding? Then what is knowledge?
Knowledge, again, can be answered in a relatively simple way. It's related, obviously, to truth. Knowledge is a representation of the world that maps onto the world without, and here's the key word, without evident error. Knowledge is that representation that maps onto the world without evident error. In other words, knowledge is our best approximation of the ideal being truth, and knowledge our best approximation of it. We reach for the ideal. The closest our reach gets to truth is what we count as knowledge.
So what is the truth between the two?
Okay, well, the truth between the two, or the distinction between the two, is that knowledge is a preferred set of beliefs that we privilege because of their access to the ideal. They most closely approximate the ideal of truth. Truth sits up there beyond our grasp, but we need this idea of truth so we have an idea of what to aim for as we try to construct knowledge. Knowledge being, of course, much higher than mere belief, or even worse, just mere opinion.
So Dr. Wagner, reading your book, a word, epistemology, is used. What is epistemology?
Epistemology goes way back to the days of the ancient Greeks, and it's still very key today. People in education and psychology have all heard of a guy by the name of Jean Piaget, and Piaget used to insist that he be called an epistemologist and not a psychologist. And interestingly enough, he was actually trained as a biologist, but he liked being called an epistemologist. Epistemology, going back to the ancient Greeks, is the study of justification of claims to know. In other words, epistemology is the study of how does someone best answer the question, well, how do you know that? And so epistemology is the study of how you best justify a response to that question. How do you know that?
Dr. Wagner, in your book, you say that most ordinary people think of the truth as realist, in a realist position. What do you really mean by that?
I think that most people, when they haven't been distracted by eloquent speakers that want to tantalize your creative imagination, most people think there is just a fact of the matter that they observe every day. A wonderful, very skillful philosopher in England back at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, G.E. Moore, talked about this position very clearly, the realist position. He said, I don't need a philosopher, a psychologist, or a scientist to tell me this is my hand I have in front of my face. Some things are just straightforwardly clear, Moore wanted to claim. Now, I'm not sure if that claim holds up altogether that well, but it does illustrate the realist position that most people hold. Most people say they know there was a stop sign in front of them when they came up to the intersection. Most people will say they know what the names of their children are. Most people will say they know what schools they got their degrees from. There are many things that we routinely will claim to know, and we aren't even aware of questioning any kind of philosophical quarrels somebody might have with our insistence that we truly know this is my hand I have in front of my face. So that's the realist position. The realist thinks knowledge can achieve the ideal of truth, and we don't go that far in our book. Though I respect the inclination to associate the realist position with actually grasping truth, I'm just too intimidated to ever say I have absolute truth of any kind.
Wow. Let's switch a gear here. So then how did pragmatism begin as a theory of truth and the epistemology?
The pragmatists, like so many other philosophers in the 19th going into the 20th century, they wanted to secure truth, just like any realist would. But the more they tried, the more they could imagine that something could run afoul of their efforts to know what they think they know. I mean, after all, we rely on the stuff that's inside our brain, that neurological engine, for our claims to perceive things accurately, to organize our perceptions in ways that are shareable without loss of information in the process. Boy, those are big claims. And the more that you think about how well that can be achieved, the more uneasy you should become. Neuroscientists become uneasy when they talk about how well we can share things. People in computer science these days recognize how difficult it is to share information as though we have the same thing in mind. One of the reasons that we're waiting so long to have self-driving cars is because while we know that human beings do a relatively good job of piecing together perceptions and making decisions about what's going on in the world, in the road ahead of them, automobiles are limited to algorithms that are limited in their anticipation of what's going on. We may watch, as a driver, ordinary driver, we may watch the eyes of a driver in the car just to the right of us who looks like they're going to run through a stop sign. How do you program that into a computer? So how do we make sense of this effort that we engage in, where we try to map knowledge onto the world so that knowledge and truth become one thing? The pragmatists go, you can't do it. You can't do it. Now, the danger that the pragmatists had to run up against is that there were some people who had giant egos and small minds. And these people with giant egos and small minds, I call them swaggerists. They swagger about because they think as long as they've been able to make a problem disappear, that somehow that means they solved it. Well, no, that doesn't mean that you solved it. If you're running short on your bank account and creditors keep on sending their bills to you, just because you push all the bills off your desk into a garbage can doesn't mean that the problem's been solved. Has it disappeared in the sense that it's no longer on your desk? Yeah, but the problem's still there. So swaggerists say they're problem solvers because they make this problem disappear. That's not the route that the pragmatist went. And the pragmatist comes nothing close to being a swaggerist. The pragmatist says, I recognize the limitations of our best thinking, but I'm going to demand that we use what we've learned about our best thinking to ensure that we're most likely to identify those approximations of the truth that are more accurate than competing approximations of the truth. And that's what the pragmatist focuses on. How best can I identify knowledge claims deserving to be honored above competing knowledge claims or mere beliefs or opinions?
Wow. Well said. So what are the advantages of administrators properly understanding pragmatism, right?
Yeah, well, one of the things, take a look at education. Something goes wrong, and we have violence happening in a school. Of course, Uvalde comes to mind, but let's go back even a couple of decades before that. You look around and it seems to you that there's more violence in the school. Well, what am I going to do? Well, somebody might say, well, we've got to have cops on campus. Somebody else might say, well, we still have plenty of violence in schools, and yet we have cops on campus throughout the school day. And kids are bringing weapons to school. So what are we going to do? Well, once again, a swaggerist might come along and make a problem go, well, let's say, we'll have metal detectors. How about that? We'll spend a ton of money. We'll have metal detectors. There's still violence on the campuses. You go, well, so what's going on? We're mistaking Band-Aids for solutions. A campus cop is a Band-Aid. Not terribly long ago, when I was in school, and it doesn't seem to be terribly long ago to me, went to a high school of 4,400 kids. There were no campus cops, ever. Once in 4 years, a police car came to the school, and it was rumored all over the place that the police were at school for some reason. Well, evolutionarily, our brains haven't changed much in 60 years. In fact, they haven't changed much in a couple of thousand years. There haven't been that many generations to bring about evolutionary change. Bacteria can change very quickly because they change every few days, but human beings, it takes us 50, 100 years or more to change from generation to generation. So what was possible 50 years ago, high schools of 4,400 kids and no need for cops on campus, there's no reason why that can't be possible again. You don't make it possible by pretending a Band-Aid is the same as a solution. Now, this isn't to say that maybe you do need to bring a cop on campus for now because you need a Band-Aid. When you're wounded, you need a Band-Aid. You need a tourniquet. But if you leave a tourniquet on forever, you've actually created further problems for yourself. Tourniquets and Band-Aids are necessary to buy time to construct a solution and to put it to work. Metal detectors. Metal detectors are Band-Aids. No metal detector made violence go away. All it did was slow things down for a while, we hope, until the root causes of violence figure out a way to still bring violence back into the classrooms. The Band-Aid only bought us time. If the administrator doesn't recognize the difference between Band-Aids that are there to buy them time and solutions that are made to improve the situation, then the situation will continue to deteriorate and we'll just be putting on more and more Band-Aids. Now, when I talk about the administrator, it just doesn't mean a building principal. It would also apply to superintendents in education. It would apply to state boards of education. It applies to governors, US senators, president, heads of departments of education, departments of defense. You can't fix problems just by putting Band-Aids on. And it's important for any skillful administrator to recognize the role of a Band-Aid as opposed to a solution, to recognize when a Band-Aid is necessary, because they are necessary at times, and then to recognize that once you've got that Band-Aid on, now it's time to work on a solution, not to pretend you've made the problem go away. You've bought yourself some time. Now work on a solution.
Very timely advice. So in your book, so you've described educational researchers as evidentialist. Or what is evidentialism?
Evidentialism kind of grew out of actually pragmatism many years ago. The person that we most commonly associate with the concept of evidentialism is a fellow named Peter Lipton. And he said that in the end, science doesn't deduce answers. In the end, what science does is create explanations to the best answer imaginable. Solutions to the best, solutions, given what we know, that are the best we can imagine at the time. And so evidentialists in education, educational research and elsewhere, evidentialists start right off with the idea that, we're not so presumptuous as to think that we're going to be identifying truth right and left. We're starting off with what is the evidence that's available to us? Because that defines, that frames our problem situation. The evidence we have available to us, like it or not, frames the problem situation. I mean, one might say, golly, I wish we had more evidence to be able to, come up with a better solution to what we're confronting right now. Well, yeah, we might like to have that. But if we can't find that additional evidence, we still have to frame research protocols now that hopefully will push us in the direction of what right now we know nothing about. There was a Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration by the name of Donald Rumsfeld. And the press made fun of him for a statement that he made that was actually very sophisticated. He said in response to some kind of question, well, we don't even know what we don't know. Now, the press made hay with that, but it actually is a very sophisticated observation he made. We don't even know what we don't know. It's too easy to start framing problems based on what you think you have evidence for right now, given that you haven't looked beyond the evidence that's immediately available to you and haven't even imagined there might be something more to look for. And so the evidentialist is going to say, the evidence we have frames the problem, but it doesn't mean it frames the solution. The evidence we have before us might direct us to creating additional research for collecting new evidence we're not even aware of yet. And that as the bulwark of our evidence grows, then our chances of addressing some of these really big problems can increase. But to the evidentialists, they say, you start framing the problem by looking at what evidence is available right now and not allowing that to simply define the problem on any kind of big scale, but looking at that evidence and seeing if there are clues there to what other evidence ought to be sought before we continue further in the master investigation of some big problem.
Makes sense. And I'm going to ask us to switch gears here a little bit. So what is the difference between statistics and probability theory?
Well, that too is a good question. You're asking many good questions.
Good teachers.
Probability theory was largely put together in the 16th century by Blaise Pascal, Fermat, the Bernoulli family. If you go to any major university today and look up a class in the math department called probability theory, and pick up one of the books and look at it, it's going to be full of equations and far fewer words. Now, at that same university, walk over to one of the typically social science disciplines or biology or whatever, and pick up a statistics book. And you may discover something, namely the number of equations in it are far fewer than what you saw in the probability book. And there's a lot more words in the book. Now, why is that? Turns out, before I even wrote my stuff, I should say after I wrote my stuff, but I came across this. There's a guy named Andrew Clayton, who recently wrote a book called Bernoulli's Fallacy. And in Bernoulli's Fallacy, he talks about the origins of probability theory, particularly talking about the Bernoulli family and all the work that they did. And one of the points that he then derives from that, which I think today most theorists in statistics share, statistics is essentially a philosophical theory of how to employ certain mathematical tools to secure knowledge by more closely approximating truth than we were able to before. Concepts such as randomness is not a mathematical concept, it's a philosophical concept. A test of significance is not a mathematical concept, it's a philosophical concept. Some of the major writers on statistics, in fact, have one of these fellows here, brand new biography that came out, which is a wonderful book, and it's about John Venn. And you've all heard of Venn diagrams. John Venn and Francis Galton back in the 19th century, they just had a heyday using the tools of probability to start looking at all sorts of things in the world and see if they could, discover normal distributions, and if they could discover how many stanines certain information seemed to be away from some midpoint. And it's a wonderful time. And the work that they were doing, as John Venn used to write, was in inductive logic. John Stuart Mill was another one writing at that time. They were all doing what was called inductive logic. Logic, since the time of the ancient Greeks, has been one of the 5 standard areas of philosophy. Now you have deductive logic, and in fact, the American Association of Formal Logic is made up roughly of half philosophers and half mathematicians. But they're over here. The people who are applied are doing inductive logic. And, the most rigorous areas of inductive logic that we have available to us are those available to us through what we call statistical theory. Statistical theory is taking what the mathematicians have given us, adding some of these philosophical concepts that we have tried to define as potently as we can, so that we can sharpen our observations, do a better job of collecting data, a better job of aggregating the data, and then finally, a better job of interpreting and inductively inferring from the data some approximation of how the world really is. Well, not too long ago, we had a lot of talk going on about, pandemic around the world, about COVID and different vaccines that were out there and so on. And all the work that the medical scientists were doing was employing statistical resources to come up with the best approximation of whether or not a certain treatment or a certain vaccine was sufficiently potent to employ for the benefit of the public. They weren't grasping truth. They never claimed to be grasping truth. Their job was to more closely approximate it. Well, how do you get there? Well, you inductively derive things from what you observed. And that means you're doing statistics as you're trying to figure out how best do I look at research design, because that's a contrivance. Research design is a contrivance of bright minds that are going to employ some mathematical tools, some very precise definitions, put it together, and hopefully come up with the best approximations of truth available to us at the moment.
So you're saying statistics is a division of inductive logic.
Right.
And everyone knows inductive logic, subdivision of philosophy, statistics.
Right.
Must be part of philosophy, or at least philosophy of science.
Right.
So then can you describe what statistics is as a division of philosophy that uses probability theory?
Yeah. When you're trying to define what counts as randomness, there's no addition or subtraction or powers, exponential powers that will ever tell you what an exact definition of randomness should do. Now, in a realist sense, remember we talked about realist before. In a realist sense, we could say randomness is when there are no evident patterns. But mathematicians have found that in all those tables you find in the back of many stat books, even at the graduate level, that mathematicians have found patterns in those randomization tables. In fact, when we try to find anything that's random, the closest we've come is to something that's called white noise. The father of information theory, a fellow by the name of Claude Shannon. He was at Bell Labs at the time and then later on at MIT. Father of information theory. He, along with others, had speculated that white noise, which is what you get when you pick up your telephone and you hear shh in the back, or anytime you're talking on you get that kind of stuff, that white noise may be the closest we have to any model of randomness in the real world. So we can come up with a philosophically realist definition of randomness, but mathematics didn't drive us to that. It's speculation. Randomness has no patterns. When we started looking to the world, genius mathematicians kept finding sooner or later a new way of identifying a pattern. So randomness kept disappearing from every effort to find a model of it in the real world. Well, we're not going to stop doing statistical research in the biomedical sciences and much of physics, and certainly not in the social sciences, because we don't have a perfect model of randomness. We're going to draw a philosophical conclusion about what we will count as random for the kind of studies that we intend to do, and we will work with that as best we can. And if we really understand the science we're working with, we're not going to pretend that we have a pure concept of randomness that's driving us forward. And same with tests of significance. As your n gets bigger and bigger, from your model, weird things happen when you're looking to see whether or not a certain hypothesis is contradicted by the evidence or not. So what do? Do we throw out all of our efforts to try to minimize error? Well, no, not at all. We acknowledge, philosophically speaking, that there's going to be error present, and we're going to try to minimize it with our prudent, these are all philosophical terms, with our prudent use of test of significance to guide us, but not to assure us that we've nailed down truth. Statistics has done a wonderful job in many areas of our life. We rely on our food chains to deliver food that's relatively good. Now, every head of lettuce isn't examined by some expert out there in the field. Every side of beef is not analyzed by some expert out there in the field, but they sample and they have a theory of sampling. That's a philosophical theory. So they have a theory of sampling, and that theory of sampling is employed by a grander philosophical statistical theory that says we can pretty well assure the safety of our food chains with these statistical processes involving sampling that leads to us putting safe food on our plates. In education, maybe we could do a better job by sampling school districts. It would cost us a lot less money than these massive standardized tests for every single student, and making judgments about every single teacher, every single semester, every single year. There may be ways in which we can identify statistical effectiveness of institutions, perhaps school by school and district by district, over a period of several years, using sampling processes that would be much less expensive and much less threatening to both students and teachers on a day-by-day basis, worried about getting past that test at the end of this year and every year. Just a thought. But statistics is made up of just these statistical, philosophical thoughts that hopefully reveal the most prudent judgments we can make that will in fact extend our reach toward approximating truth and pressing us away from obvious error.
So, great example. So why should people notice the different stakeholders in education, given the example there? Education have different ways of understanding truth and knowledge, with each different stakeholder having its own. So why should people notice that, or notice the difference?
Well, number one customer of K through 12 education is really the taxpayer. It's really kind of odd because I'll hear people talk as though students are the customer, but even in public higher education, the student, I don't know how much of the percentage of their education are paying for it. In public higher education, the state's paying for a lot. Parents pay for a lot that the state doesn't pay for. and on and on. Certainly K through 12, the customer is the person paying for this stuff. And so the customer is the public, the taxpayer, the guy who might have spent 40 years pumping gas, but he's still a customer of K through 12 education. He wants people that when they graduate, if they're doing his taxes, they can do his taxes well. If they're a nurse that he needs to go to for some healthcare times, that they're competent. He's paying for that. He's paying for that competency. We misdirect things if we think that a student is the customer of K through 12 education. There in the law, there's something called third-party beneficiaries, and that means that somebody else is a customer. They pay a vendor to do something for the benefit of a third party. Maybe students are considered third-party beneficiaries, but the customer is still the person paying. Another theory might say, well, students are the ones who are shaped by education, and presumably they're to be shaped in some way consistent with what the customer is paying for. And again, the customer is, the taxpayer. Well, to a lot of the taxpayers, what they tend to think in terms of realist terms. So they're thinking that what they're paying for is a kid has to know X, Y, and Z. They have to know it. A lot of politicians are real happy to go with, they got to know the answer on a multiple choice test, 17 a C. And that's real black and white. And the politician says, man, that makes it look like we can really identify accountability and whether or not our students are learning. Yet we know students can pass a multiple choice test about the Pythagorean theorem just because they've been coached to recognize that the test is likely to have triangles, right triangles, that are 1 is equal to 3, one side is equal to 4, and then the other side is going to be equal to what? 5. So they may not understand the Pythagorean theorem, but they have been coached to keep their eyes open for 3, 4, and 5. And if a standardized question sends to ask them anything at all about the Pythagorean theorem, you just look for the one of those 3 numbers that's offered as an alternative and not as part of the stem of the question. So now we get kids that have passed the test, and so presumably that would suggest that they've learned it, and yet they can't go out and shingle roofs. They can't lay carpet. And there are people who have never been through high school who have learned through practice how to shingle roofs and how to lay carpet. And they don't know they're using the Pythagorean theorem to do their measurements, but that's what they're doing. So, the customer, to the extent that they're realists, may be overlooking some very important things. Another customer, what about the administrators? As the administrators look down at their teachers and say, look, I'm paying you guys, right? The administrator says, I'm the boss, right? I'm divvying up the money. I hired you. I'm divvying up the money. And so I've got a claim to what you're producing. And if he thinks or she thinks that what matters most is that no one makes waves. So now he's looking at a staff that will produce, decent test scores, minimize fights in the school, or at least don't let them get public. I'll tell you a real story about that. Actually, it was an episode that happened here in the city of Houston. It's about 25 years ago. A teacher was tired of the violence in the hallways day after day. He complained to the principal about it, and the principal just wanted to get him out of his office. Let's not talk about this. The principal just wanted band-aids. He didn't want solutions. And the teacher had even gone to the superintendent, or a deputy superintendent for the district, and had also gotten chased away again. And this teacher brought, it was an 8mm camera, to give you an idea how long ago it was, brought an 8mm camera to school, and he filmed fights in the hallways over a week. So it wasn't just a single episode. And then he gave what he had filmed to a well-known journalist here in Houston by the name of Wayne Delchafino. And of course, it made it onto the news. And then it became a big issue. Now, all of a sudden, we have to address the violence in this particular school. Whereas before, as long as the public didn't know about it, then just keep your head down and let things keep on going. This was an administrator. I hope most administrators aren't like this, but this is an administrator who was thinking to himself, what matters is just don't bring distraction onto what we're doing. And so he probably thought of himself as a pragmatist because he didn't understand pragmatism as you do now. But he probably thought himself as a pragmatist. What he really was a swaggerist. As long as the problems don't become public, then we can keep on slipping by. Now, in this case, the problems became public, and that administrator, by the way, lost his job. The third one, the educational researcher, they aren't, or shouldn't at least be willing to settle for just certainly a swaggerist conclusion, but they may not even be willing to settle for a pragmatist conclusion because they've got a little bit more time and a little bit more, I use the word idealism not in a way to say anything derogatory about anybody else, but to say that their ideal of reaching for that golden calf in the sky, the truth, they want it to be, it's real important to them that it's pure in some sense. And so they're not laboring under this or that deadline necessarily. To the extent that they're good scientists, then what they are laboring under more than anything else is that what they have produced can be seen by others like them as resistant, for good reason, resistant to falsification. The integrity of the observations and the collection of data was done with integrity and comprehensiveness, and that the aggregation of the data was done with mathematical soundness, and that the philosophical interpretation resulting from it all was done with attention to careful reasoning. I just happen to have another book at hand where a fellow by the name of Keith Morrison, just recently, the book's only, it came out in 2022, and he's talking about replication in education studies. We already know from research that's been done by Stanford statistician Ioannidis that social science articles done the previous 10 years to when he wrote an article in 2005 in Science, the journal Science, that half of those social science articles could not be replicated. Morrison is concerned about the same sort of thing in education. Yeah, and he's a statistician. If you're going to do good statistical work, if you're going to keep up the ideal of the evidentialist, then your research ought to be susceptible to replication. If you got it right the first time, you ought to be able to run the study again. And the study ought to come out looking very much alike as it did the first time. But Morrison is saying, yeah, and he's saying part of social responsibility of educational research is to replicate more. And the system doesn't encourage that, unfortunately. The system doesn't publish many articles because you replicated what Smith already published. But in a sense, they should, because those efforts at replication are how we find out whether or not the original study that Smith did really does hold up, in fact. So the three models of truth and knowledge that each of these three groups have taxpayers, even the kids tend to think as realists. The administrators and the researchers, they don't all align themselves. And I think education can become more effective and more potent the more that we understand, the more that all those stakeholders recognize that in fact they have different views of knowledge and truth, and how might they align them a little bit more effectively so that each can help the other, so that the educational researcher helps come up with a solution, and the administrator is happy to take off the tourniquet because he doesn't need to have a tourniquet anymore. We're finding ways of avoiding violence. And if we find ways of avoiding violence, then the taxpayer is happy because their kid's able to go to school and not have to worry about if they're going to be subject to some kind of mishap. So a greater alignment on these big concepts of truth and knowing might do an immense amount of good. Again, Rumsfeld, he shouldn't have been made fun of for saying, we don't even know what we don't know. That really is very profound. We don't even know what we don't know. And if we care about what we're studying, we want to find out more about what it is we don't know so we can understand it better. I think that sums up things today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, for your time. This is always enlightening to have these conversations with you. And I'm so glad that we're able to record this and post it on the YouTube channel. So folks, if you want to listen to Dr. Wagner share more thoughts on leadership and ethics, as well as Knowing for Education, this book or this video, feel free to search for his name on YouTube and find more such educational content. Thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, for your time. Till the next one, you don't even know.
Ravi, you've been very kind, and I look forward to working with you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Have a great day.